And so we begin. The first flaw we have to cover today is the USCM's private interests. The National Security Act of 2101 formally established the Colonial Marines in its structure. Thus, in theory, they're an army of the public under the United America's Allied Command. Their duty is to maintain security for all United America's signatories and extraterrestrial colonies that fall under the United States of America's control. However, the USCM has a very questionable relationship with the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, a large British and Japanese multinational conglomerate founded in 2099 by the merger of Weyland Corporation and the Yutani Corporation. Weyland-Yutani is primarily a technology supplier manufacturing synthetic humans, spaceships, and computers. And of course, one of their clients is the United States Colonial Marines, whom they also supply weapons to. On paper, the USCM is not directly controlled by Weyland-Yutani, and yet the company often employs them as a security force to protect their interests. In truth, it's not entirely clear how independent the USCM is in regard to Weyland-Yutani, and for the most part it seems like the latter exercises significant control over the Colonial Marines, a control that only becomes more absolute over time. The problem here is that private control means that the USCM doesn't necessarily work for the common good. And Weyland-Yutani is consistently portrayed as an immoral, predatory company. They are even willing to sacrifice human lives, Colonial Marine lives, to get their hands on living xenomorph tissue. And so the USCM doesn't really have a clear mission or credo that can unify and motivate its soldiers. And while I can appreciate Weyland-Yutani's goal of capturing the xenomorphs to create weapons of mass destruction out of their biology in order to ensure that humanity remains the dominant species in the universe, killing humans to keep aliens alive goes against the Humanity First Code, specifically Article 2X, which states, quote, "No human shall in any way aid in the perpetuation of or take action that might be of benefit to alien species, even if such actions are intended primarily to benefit humanity." But I digress. The Colonial Marines cannot really be trusted because of the influence that Weyland-Yutani wields over them. The next flaw is platoon size. The Colonial Marines platoon is lacking in terms of numbers. The USCM platoon is made up as follows. First, a rifle squad consists of 4 Marines, including a corporal, a lance corporal, and 2 privates. 2 squads together are led by a sergeant and along with a driver of an M577 armored personal carrier make up a section. In operations where required, a UD-4 dropship is attached to the section, which requires additional crew as well. 2 sections together make up a full rifle platoon, which usually comes to about 25 Marines, though as we see, this number is often less. There are benefits that come from the smaller size platoon, such as mobile efficiency, but given that the Marines get chopped down by aliens with little effort, numbers would help a bit. The Starship Troopers Mobile Infantry Platoon bests the USCM by 10 soldiers, and the Clone Troopers have 41 to a platoon. More numbers also means the group has more weapons and ammo with them, and more Marines to carry out strategies against the aliens. The next flaw we have is with the USCM's armor. The core of the Colonial Marines armor system in the 22nd century is the M3 pattern personal armor, an armored vest. Manufactured by Armet Battlefield Systems, one of the companies that recently got your Facebook data, it is designed to balance lightness and comfort with optimum protection. Optimum protection against ammunition. Additionally, a Marine's head protection is provided by the M10 pattern ballistic helmet. The M3 armor won't do too well when dealing with high-velocity ball ammunition or high-explosive armor-piercing rounds. However, it provides adequate protection against low-powered ball ammunition, explosive bullets, and grenade or artillery fragments. Of course, the problem here should be clear. Guns don't kill people. Xenomorphs do. And clearly the Marines' armor in the 22nd century is not built for the fight in front of them. To be fair, when the Marines first encountered the Xenomorphs on LV-426 in the 2170s, there was no way they could have known what to expect. That said, in the video game Aliens Colonial Marines, the USCM has available to them acid-resistant armor designed specifically to provide resistance to Xenomorph acid blood. Nonetheless, Xenomorphs are able to slice through Colonial Marines with a similar ease as arachnids do mobile infantry, thanks to obsolete armor. The next flaw we have to talk about are exoskeletons. The Colonial Marines have a bunch of exoskeletons available to them. Overall, that's a good thing. but the famous P-5000 powered workloader that Ellen Ripley uses to dispose of the Xenomorph Queen aboard the USS Sulaco really isn't great. The power loader is a mechanized exoskeleton used for lifting heavy materials and objects. The P-5000 is heavily employed by the United States Colonial Marine Corps to load supplies on board their spaceships. Power loaders are equipped with hydraulic claws that can be used to hold and move objects. The exoskeleton might be powerful, but it's heavy, clunky, and slow, and it provides very little shielding from attacking enemies. Ripley somehow manages to best the alien queen, but inside the loader actually seems like the worst place to be if a xenomorph is chasing after you. Yes, the P-5000 isn't designed to fight aliens, but I'm not even sure it could get a ship loaded faster than a standard forklift could. Additionally, given that the mobile infantry has powered suits available to them that give them godlike powers, we have to count the slow, unwieldy P-5000 power loader as a knock against the Colonial Marines. The next flaw we have to talk about is the USCM's underuse of synthetic humans, aka not humans, robots. Each platoon usually features only one synthetic. Bishop, the android aboard the Sulaco, is much smarter and seemingly more physically capable than the Marines themselves. He's an expert across multiple fields of science and technology. It's also a lot harder to kill an android. Don't get me wrong, I know that there is a risk of rebellion if too many synthetics are employed by one platoon, but a few more really wouldn't hurt. And sending synthetics to confront the aliens so humans don't have to die would seem like a tempting proposition. Xenomorphs don't as readily attack synthetics as they do humans anyway. Okay, that was an exception. But for the most part, xenomorphs only target living organisms. In general, it seems like when the terraforming colony on LV-426 went silent, it might have been smarter to send in androids to investigate, especially given Ellen Ripley's warnings about murderous super aliens. The next flaw to consider is the Colonial Marines' weaponry. Now, the Colonial Marines are very technologically advanced, and generally their weaponry is very good. The M41A pulse rifle seems to be an exceptionally effective weapon. But still, for an intergalactic space force, the Colonial Marines' guns aren't ideal. They wield some weapons that heavily limit their mobility. The M56 Smart Gun, for instance, is a stupid weapon. It, like the loader exosuit, is heavy and clunky. Perhaps from distance on open terrain the gun would make more sense, but it was completely debilitating for Private Vasquez to have to haul the weapon around inside buildings and around tight corridors. The weapon is also nearly useless in combating the quick-moving xenomorphs. What the Colonial Marines really need are small, powerful weapons. The noisy cricket from Men in Black would be a good fit for them. This leads us into the next flaw, which is mismanagement. The Colonial Marines are not a well-managed force on the ground. Somehow a completely inexperienced officer in Lieutenant Gorman is given the command over the mission to investigate LV-426. Now, perhaps the mismanagement here was purposeful on Weyland-Yutani's part, but sending a brand new commander to confront what might be, according to Ripley's warnings, an alien invasion is tremendously stupid. And then, the Marines are constantly poorly equipped. When investigating the atmosphere processing station on LV-426, they carry rifles that fire explosive rounds into what is essentially a giant fusion reactor. And the team on LV-426 has absolutely no contact with anyone on the base back on Earth. No one seems to be overseeing the mission from afar. The team on the ground seems to pretty much be able to do whatever they please. Overall, the worst mismanagement comes in sending in only one platoon to investigate an entire missing terraforming colony. It would seem that if the entire population on LV-426 went silent, perhaps more than one team should go in to check it out. This all feeds into the next flaw, the Marines' poor training. As much as the Colonial Marines are hyped up as an elite fighting force, they do little to live up to that name. They act like overconfident idiots pre-mission, and on the ground freak out in combat situations and are unsure what to do. Lieutenant Gorman knows how to play it by the book, but has no ability to improvise or think on his feet. When things go wrong, he completely loses his cool, as does Private Hudson. The Marines also don't seem overly skilled in weapons usage either, aside from Corporal Hicks. To be fair, they weren't expecting to fight against giant xenomorphs, but that they just fire away without thinking is not indicative of well-trained soldiers. They even almost shoot a little girl, because they were so quick on the trigger rather than calm, cool, and collected. As a matter of fact, the person most proficient with the Marines' weapons seems to be Ripley. Then of course, the next flaw has to be tactics. The Colonial Marines almost have no battle strategy at all, save for go in and kill. They don't carefully lay out their plans before entering buildings, and don't do much in the way of assigning different roles to different Marines. On the way into the atmosphere processing station on LV-426, Sergeant Apone barks out some direction, but in general they all seem to go in the same way, stick together as a large group along the entire route through the tunnels, and cluster together in linear fashion. There was little patience in planning despite the Marines having an entire map of the building. They had almost no plan in place in the case of an ambush aside from run away. Poor tactics cost them 6 Marines in this instance. Finally, the last flaw is that the Colonial Marines are spread too thin. According to the Colonial Marines Technical Manual, in the fiscal year 2179, the year that the Colonial Marines landed on LV-426, the strength of the USCM Corps stood at 165,000 Marines, with an additional 50,000 more in reserve. The USCM is expected to protect territories across huge distances in space. Perhaps this is why they were only able to send 1 platoon to LV-426 in the first place. The Starship Troopers Mobile Infantry was able to lose over 300,000 soldiers at the Battle of Klendathu and still carry on pretty easily. The Colonial Marines can't sacrifice near those numbers against the Xenomorphs. Okay, you sons of a monkey's nutsack, it's time to vote for the Colonial Marines. Click up here in the corner and rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. You'll get another chance as well after my next video highlighting their advantages. And of course, Alan will be on the way soon to cover the United Nations Space Command from Halo. For now, for the sake of humanity, like, comment, and subscribe. Don't do it for me. Do it for Argentina. I'll catch you next time. Generation Films, dismissed!